I think the ability to create my why and have greater clarity with why I'm doing what I'm doing, that helped immensely in overcoming my psychological nerves.
So I wanted to start off with a question about practicing, but I figured it might be helpful to have a little context first to better get into this question. And
Mhm.
so as a Suzuki kid myself, I grew up hearing the name John Kendall wherever I went. And so I was tickled to see that this was actually your grandfather. I just didn't make the connection because I figured Kendall's a relatively common name and such. So I wonder if you could share a little bit about the musical family that you grew up in before we get started with this practice question.
That's really funny. Yes. Are you John? Are you related to John Kendall, the John Kendall? And I'm like, yeah, that's grandfather. Yeah, in his brown jumpsuit, and we'd go down and like ride the tractor and hoe potatoes um and feed the chickens and then collect the eggs, and they're so warm, and we'd have poached eggs for breakfast. And this is all at Grammy and Grandfather's house in Edwardsville, Illinois. But our family gatherings at Thanksgiving time, at the December holidays, were playing string quartets um, with, I think it was the second violin part would sometimes get subbed out with horn because my Uncle Christopher played horn at the time. We would have community gatherings singing parts of Handel's Messiah. And it was just, music was just part of every day. And we'd have all of our extended family gatherings were just live, so alive with great energy, handed down from grandfather's Suzuki influence. And I guess if your grandfather brings Suzuki to your continent, then you're probably going to end up studying Suzuki, as the case happened. But basically, that energy from those holiday times and all of us being together in there at Toadwood Scrubs in Edwardsville, Illinois, that was sort of the family homestead for decades. And Nicholas and I, my brother and I, who plays violin, we would, for our spring break, go to Grammy Grandfather's, and we would get to help Grammy with the honeybees and collecting the honey. We would, as I mentioned, feed the chickens, do the compost to feed the chickens, collect the eggs. Um, and it was just so much fun and in nature as much as playing music. And our childhood, I say our because Nicholas and I talk about this all the time. Our childhood was just steeped in these wonderful memories of music making and being in nature and working in clay pots. My Grammy was a potter and a violist and a naturalist and everything. And then grandfather was, we would get lessons when we were supposed to practice. He would just come up and, well, what about that? What about that slide there between? How are you connecting that? Is that an overhand slide? So we'd unpack some of that, and just it was spontaneous lessons. It wasn't in the sense of like teaching. It was in the sense of exploring the music together, and it was super fun. So I think that high energy fun and focus and practice also extended then through the whole year of our daily practice, of instrumental daily practice.
So it sounds like your experience of music growing up was very kind of organically tied into just being a kid and being involved in lots of other things that you were very naturally involved in whenever you visited your grandparents. So this might actually be a good transition anyhow into this question I had. And so I've noticed over the years that we tend to use the word practice a lot.
Hmm.
And I think it's one of those words that's often overused and not very well defined. And we probably use it to describe activities that maybe shouldn't actually be described as practice that we engage in. So I
Mm,
remember having a moment in grad school, for instance, where I finally understood what it meant to actually practice in an
mm,
effective, thoughtful, deliberate sort of way. And that changed everything, of course. It changed my experience of practicing. It changed my experiences in lessons and in rehearsals and in on stage even as well. And so I'm wondering what your experience of practicing might have been. I mean, you started saying a little bit about exploration as opposed to, drills and repetition,
mhm, mhm.
maybe perhaps. But do you feel like maybe you tended to practice more effectively from a younger age than many do? Or did you have to learn at some point how to really practice in an effective way? Like I think everyone has to at some point.
That's a great question. My personal cello practice has definitely evolved and improved because my mental focus has and my deeper understanding about what it actually is. And my practical need for efficiency has increased over time. However, grandfather was an truly an expert in deliberate practice before the term was deliberate practice. And I actually have it here on my music stand. And those listening who are Suzuki trainers might recognize the term unit practice. And indeed, from an early age, I learned from grandfather, and what I used to tell my very young students, stop, think, play between each set. So you're redirecting, you're restarting a neuron circuit, basically. Stop, think, play, repeat, and repeat and repeat. So it's basically replicate. When it works, you replicate, 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 and then it goes into our file cabinet, like Daniel Kahneman style, file one, file two, right? It gets the good stuff gets filed in there with this deliberate practice, with this careful intention of at the micro level. We're talking about learning a fingering, or is it 1 to 2? Is it 1 to 3? That kind of intention, or to a particular slide or a particular shift. So from grandfather, I did have the benefit of being aware of some particular techniques for very effective practicing. And in that regard, I feel like I had an incredible resource in grandfather, in that I got exposed at a young age what many, at least Suzuki teacher trainers, got when they were in a training seminar with grandfather, for example, as an adult. So I feel very privileged to have had that just as part of my routine without actually knowing necessarily what it was. He would be teaching me. It became very clear as I grew up how important that methodical the unit practicing was. And he has a whole method, a whole system, a whole sequence that involved in that unit practice. And in that regard, yes. So the bigger picture, though, of the word practice, that's the one that I think we as adults, not as 5-year-olds practicing for a sticker on the chart for 100 days, but we're really thinking about practice as intention. And I remember one of my favorite mentors, Joey Silverstein, he said in coaching, we were in school, and he said, every time I get out my violin, I ask, what am I doing and why? That kind of intention. And that's what I bring now in my practice these days, in my cello practice. But as I've learned from, my good friend Vijay Gupta, who's founder of Street Symphony out in LA, who used to be a member of the LA Phil and left to continue his work with this amazing nonprofit. And he has a daily practice. There are other daily practices, of course, that I think you were alluding to, that some people incorporate into their lives. But Vijay's way of talking about practice as life, he expands that to life, and it's amazing what happens when that philosophy is actually enacted by a human like Vijay, because the world changes. So I think of that word practice at micro and also macro, or the microscope level, and also more galaxy or telescopic perspective, as well as life practice.
I love the Silverstein
Mm.
framing of what it
Hmm.
is that you do when you open up your instrument. This may sound like a really obvious thing, but I think sometimes it's tough for us to identify our intentions in the first place. I think it's easy to just open up the instrument or even just start each day and go about whatever's in place for us
Hmm.
based on what's in our inbox, an email, or what shows up on our phone, or what we have scheduled on the calendar. Do you have a way, and this could be a relatively broad question, it could also be a relatively narrow one in terms of, what are you going to do today in the practice room in this particular practice session and so forth. But do you have any thoughts or tips, maybe just even based on what you've been doing lately, in terms of how to get better at identifying what our intentions are for this specific practice session or this specific semester, perhaps?
There's two sort of possible pathways. One is intention as me, as a musician, as an artist, and striving. And then there's goal setting, which is more specific and granular. And I think that's what we'll go dive into, at least I think what we're going after in this particular question. Um, for me, I'm very practical, and right now in this time of my life, I have um, either specific performances, deadlines, um, seminars, or things that I have to prepare for that drive my practice goals or practice intentions. So for cello, I have to do bowings for a particular project or a particular piece next week. I'm going to be learning Gabby Frank's Picaflor, which is a world premiere we get to do next week in the Philadelphia Orchestra. So I'm driven right now by what's right in front of me in terms of time. What do I need to do the most that's new, least familiar, and coming up soonest? So that's kind of my um, immediate technique. And then further out, big recital in the summer, for example, of newer repertoire that is also more challenging. That's kind of on my back burner of more regular but less pressure, quote unquote pressure and practice urgency. That's kind of the ongoing back burner practicing. Whenever I have an extra 15 minutes, I'm going to start practicing the ends of the Dance of the Elves just to review my fingerings, for example. But it really does come down to my extra 10 or 15 minutes at this point, and that's where my practice technique has had to become very efficient and very specific. Earlier in my career and in school, it was spending hours exploring and being specific. It was a yes and situation because time, I have a 4-year-old now, so I don't get that time back with her. So I want to be with her and have our family time and also be very intentional about my cello work. So that's what I mean by practical necessity of the now. Before that, um, I had no idea how much time I actually had. So I mean, that's just a luxury. When I think back then, in a very different sense, of course, of meaningful things in our lives.
I remember my wife discovering once we had kids that, wow, like I wasted an awful lot of time back when I was in school. So having kids can really enhance productivity necessarily. So not to get too sort of detailed or nerdy about it, but I mean, does this mean using a calendar or like a practice log or like having a weekly review or daily review? Like, is there a particular systematic way in which you approach it, or is it relatively intuitive and organic still in terms of determining what needs to be practiced in those 5 or 15 minutes that you might have in a day?
It comes down to high self-awareness. I know approximately how much time I need after I've seen the music or what needs to be done. I then prepare mentally. I don't have a calendar, although some people do use their calendar or chart. I definitely have to-do lists, but that's more to do with things like taxes or filling out some form that needs to be done. But in terms of my practice, that is just part of my mental matrix and organization that I have. And I'm very organized mentally. So I have a very specific set of which speeches I need to be working on, and it's all mental. So it's all up there in the brain, just organized. But it wouldn't be organized without the sufficient preparation of knowing myself and how I work, and knowing and seeing the music I need to be working on, so that I can best assess the amount of time I need to do. And in that way, I then design my mental map and time.
Different people operate in different ways. Some people like to have it written down, others can keep it up there and it works just fine. Is this something that, in terms of understanding yourself and how much time something is likely going to require, is
Mhm.
this just a matter of experience or like trial and error, maybe some errors that you've really learned from once upon a time that now you know better? Or like, how did that come to be?
I think my mental organization got really refined the year that I went to grad school while I was working. And I should have, in hindsight, taken a sabbatical for the amount of time that I had so much homework. And so that increased my productivity because I had regular work and I would show up to work and all my lovely colleagues would be there. We'd all be playing, but I had done like several hours of homework plus 45 minutes of practice before the 10:30 rehearsal started. So in that sense, now having a young child plus all of these other projects plus my music, it refined, definitely refined. And I would never have guessed that these things would have helped my life experience and my mental organization in that regard. But in terms of the learning curve, I think my approach has always been to learn from everything. So I don't know that there was a quote unquote mistake that happened. I did have the dream before my ninth grade recital that it was about a month before my ninth grade recital, which was the first big recital I gave, with full sonata and Britten team of the Sacred Variations and then the Rococo and this and that. And it was my first big recital, just me. And about a month before that recital, I had the dream where I walked into a big stone building that was the church venue, I guess, that was new in my dream, unrecognized. And I walk in and I see the program and I don't know any of the pieces. I just I don't even know the composers. I don't know how they go. I can't sing them. They're unrecognizable. And that got me kicked into gear. So that wasn't an actual mistake that happened, but that was definitely a subconscious moment telling me, Yumi, you need to get going on this. And that was very helpful because that ended up being a very positive experience for me. Actually, the actual recital ended up being a very positive experience for me. I had previously I got nervous once or twice in a recital, and I could feel the mental cloud and the mental tension. And this recital was about a year or two after that, and it was such a good feeling to see that change in me without a conscious effort. Um, but in that sense of performance confidence and overcoming that was great. So anyway, my dream was the sort of mistake that taught me I better be prepared and I can do more effective practicing.
Much better that it's a dream than an actual
Yeah.
experience, I'm sure. I'm wondering if you have a sense of what exactly has changed that has led your practice to be more efficient or more effective in terms of the reduction of time that's been necessary. I mean, is it maybe spending less time on things than you might have used to unnecessarily, or is it something in the actual practice activity itself or in the thought process around it?
That's a great question. There are two answers to that. The short one is in the back of my mind, I remember Pam Frank in school in some master class or some setting. She said, you should be able to do all you need to do in 1 hour of practice a day. And not the thinking about it, not the, when you're driving and I can be thinking about the phrase shape or something, but the practical element of practicing. That was always in the back of my mind. Just out of the many gems that we've all received, right? Um, that was the first part that's just kind of been there, that awareness that an amazing pedagogue and teacher and musician and person would say that. And the second element of maybe my practicing has just become more refined, or or maybe I need to do certain things a little bit with less rigor or less time because I've improved. Hopefully, that would be the assumption. Um, Certainly, yes, because in two ways. One, I put in the time. We all of us put in well over our 10,000 hours before we were in college age for sure. And so that amount of time paid off because the familiarity of the instrument was just there. And the second thing is, as I mentioned before, that self-awareness of how I practice and refining the actual practice technique. For example, I used to go through all of grandfather's 9 steps of unit practicing, the 9 families of unit practicing, because when I was first learning Shostakovich cello concerto and the scales at the last second to last page, I didn't quite know which would be the most effective. So I just ran through all of them to be prudent and to be thorough. But time-wise, that wasn't as effective as what I know now, which is exactly what is going to get the job done. Is that current method more refined because I already put in the work? Likely so. And it's because I'm also aware of what is going to be more effective now. So it's kind of yes and, or yes both, if that makes any
Right.
sense.
Well, it sounds like you're able to more quickly identify what's actually the problem here, and then being able to do the things that are going to solve that problem instead of like throwing the whole kitchen sink at it to find out what's actually the problem and what's going to work. Yeah, that makes sense.
Exactly.
Is there any part of it that's related maybe because one thing that I often hear from not just students but professionals and musicians as well who are at various stages of their career is trying to figure out when something is good enough. Like good enough is a hard
Uh-huh.
location to track down because
Mhm.
we all know excellence and like what's perfection and so forth and always striving for that, perhaps never going to reach it. And so we could spend forever trying to
Mhm.
make something sound more excellent or more perfect, but to what end, or how, at what point is it beyond what's necessary for that moment? And I mean, is that part of it as well, just knowing what I think in some ways the phrase good enough even sounds like a bad thing,
Mhm.
but I don't know. There's maybe a question in there somewhere.
That's a great point. And certainly, as a mom of a young child, there are many more things right now that are just good enough from a practical standpoint because I don't have 5 hours to dedicate the way I used to, or potentially could have used done, like to your wife's point about do we waste time when we don't realize we have it. Um, the question reminds me of this concept from grad school about harmonious passion and obsessive passion. And when we apply an obsessive passion, then there's a negative outcome beyond what the reward is of just accomplishing, nailing the shift or whatever the technical aspect of this is. Because what we're talking about here is for me, this is a technical regard, not a musical search-in one. It's just about nailing it and being in tune and right. Um, or playing fast and clean. But the obsessive passion ends up either causing physical pain or limiting our sense of humanity and our fun and our social interactions and the things that actually make us thrive and be the full people we need to be excellent musicians. So that would be obsessive passion. It becomes ultimately negative. Harmonious passion is when we are positively directing our passion, our intention, our practicing for that end. That is what we're saying here is good enough, and it serves the musical goal. If I practice too much, I'm actually not able to engage in the life things that are going to make me a whole person, a whole musician, and a healthy musician, body and mind and heart. So that's sort of the concept that I have. It's you could woodshed this to the end till the cows come home, and it's not going to actually make an impact, an audible, impactful difference. And you've just wasted 5 hours instead of going outside and taking a walk or baking your favorite muffins or spending time with people you care about, or practicing something else. Right.
Right.
Like get over it and just move on. So also an element of I've got this much time and then I'm going to move on as well. So I often preempt that by just saying I've got this much time, I'm going to do my best, and then I'm going to move on after 15 minutes because I just have to get to the next thing. And if it means bringing everything up a level in quality, there's still a little unevenness, that's okay. I've got the next day to try to minimize the gap, so to speak, the technical gap that we might be talking about.
I've heard Pam talk about even limiting the number of repetitions you allow yourself, even beyond time, which I also like as a way of perhaps putting some constraints on what we would otherwise do to the passage, which would involve many, many more repetitions and perhaps is healthy or necessary. So,
Yeah, and then increases the intention of each one. It's
right.
like depth versus breadth.
That's maybe a good transition actually to one of the things that I was curious to talk with you more about, which is how my understanding is that there was a difficult moment that the Philadelphia Orchestra went through some years ago, and it prompted you one way or another to apply and enroll in this applied positive psychology program that the University of Pennsylvania is known for. And I wonder, beyond what drew you to this, I wonder if you could say a little bit about what some of your biggest takeaways from the program were.
The biggest takeaways were validating so much of what we already know as musicians and as a Suzuki and also as a Waldorf student. That's where I went to school. And so much of the practice is validated and replicated and studied in social science, and it was incredibly validating to see and feel that. The biggest takeaway is the people. The same way our music world is so rich with wonderful people and sharing and joy in the music and the 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 excitement about what we do. This is how I feel. This is my world. The same way for MAP, for the Masters of Applied Positive Psychology, MAPP. We call it MAP. But the same way, there's this amazing community of people studying positive psychology and applying it in their own domains. And it's just an incredible community. So that's the big picture, is just the human element of it. From a practical element, taking things back to our domain, our music world. And specific for me now as a mentor, a lot of it is about this, actually the social element, and the mentor about relationships, student and teacher relationships, about cultivating environments and where the garden can grow, so to speak, where everybody can thrive. Um, from a more psychological perspective, the self-compassion and the ability to change ourselves so that we can be more effective musicians. If folks have struggled with negative self-talk and any sort of psychological barriers like that in bashing themselves down if they miss a passage in an important moment or a high pressure, high stakes moment or competition or audition, if there's negativity around that, rather than being transformed into a positive, like, oh, I'm going to get to practice that more so I can be a little bit more passionate about that practice, not obsessive though. If there's more self-compassion, how to undo those negative grooves, the negative self-talk that can often be an undiscovered an untapped obstacle for folks when they get to this level of how to actually overcome those mental challenges. Positive psychology with the mindfulness, with the practices is immensely helpful with creating positive pathways and positive interventions to help address what I'm just calling negative self-talk, but I think we understand that that can mean different things for different folks and even at different times. So that was a really interesting and continues to be a really interesting exploration, not just me personally, also in my role as a mentor and as a teacher, and helping the next generation unpack, to the extent they're comfortable or is necessary, what their negative self-talk might be that might actually be holding them back in an unproductive way. It is important for us to be negative in the sense that we recognize what needs to be improved. If something is out of tune, we can reframe that as saying, oh, the F sharp needs to be higher, which is how I teach. As Mr. Silverstein would say, teach positive. So instead of saying that's out of tune, we say, that G sharp needs to be higher or lower, right? That you sort of fix it for the student so that they can take it directly to the solution. But that kind of teach positive, um, which balances out the negative, meaning we're not denying that bad things happen, we're accepting them and reframing them towards a positive end so that there's a solution there. That's one of my biggest takeaways in practice right now. There are plenty of concepts and things that pop out um, at different moments of life, of intention, of teaching, of performance. But those are some of the biggest the biggest granular takeaways.
It sounds like this has certainly had an impact on your teaching, if not maybe changing any teaching behaviors, because it sounds like these are things that you are already doing. It at least maybe gave you more context or rationale for them as being supported. I'm wondering, so this is something that I've encountered sometimes where students or musicians for that matter can't help but engage out of habit in a lot of negative self-talk or these kind of self-sabotaging narratives
Mm-hmm.
about who they are and what they're capable of and so forth. And unfortunately, what's difficult sometimes is that these feel really true. And
Mm-hmm.
the longer we've repeated them, the longer we've sort of internalized them, the more evidence there appears to be, at least that we can interpret in line with that existing self-sabotaging narrative or negative self-talk. How have you been able to help students who you kind of find in that state start to move away from, or at least be open to other potential ways of being more self-compassionate and I don't want to say positive necessarily, but just
Mm-hmm.
maybe even a little more realistic about what's actually true and what's just been ingrained after many years?
I love this question of habit, because that is the daily practice that actually are the building blocks of who we are. I'll share this concept. It's got three layers, but it's embedded in. It's actually just me in my professional sense of we have habits that then you mentioned the sort of vicious cycle that we become who we think we are, we become, then we keep that vicious cycle if it is a negative one. That can also be a positive cycle or circle. But the biggest thing that will support habit change, the granular, the daily habit, my identity. So there are three layers for this. The top layer, the top umbrella is our identity. My identity is as a musician, as an artist, as in a performance sense, right? Not an athlete, not a like Olympic athlete, but as an artistic performer and searcher. I am a treasure hunter and a forever student. Those are my identities. Those embody curiosity for what else could be, what musically is out there, what else, how else could I play this phrase? Oh, who else does, oh yeah, oh, this has so much soul in it. There's constant searching musically. And there's a treasure hunter aspect, like even in with my child, it's like, oh, look at the stick or the rocks. There's an element of being a treasure hunter and having a sense of wonder in life. These identities are for me the who I am. The next layer down is how does that manifest in our lives, in my life, that is in performance, music performance, that is, in our concerts. It's in hosting my podcast with my best friend in orchestra, Joe Conyers. He's our principal bass. Um, we host our podcast. We give keynotes and presentations to help for other industries learn more about the music industry and about us and how we can cross pollinate ideas and learn from each other across industries. I'm doing seminars on my own and recitals and things. So the second layer is sort of the output of this identity. The third layer is the daily habit and the granular. And that is where the rubber meets the road, right? And that's for each of us, the putting in practice so that each of these other layers can be a part of a whole and coherent existence and sense of purpose. But I would encourage folks who are struggling with or questioning or open to tweaking their habits mentally, physically, in practice, in technical practice, in time management, seeing, making sure that their habit aligns with who they identify as. So I now also identify as a very efficient practicer because of my life right now and my practical schedule. So I have increased my efficiency to be, as you said, I've also become better at problem solving, which then makes my application of the solution much more streamlined and efficient. But I would highly encourage folks who are looking to make any habit changes. Who am I? I'm a kind person. If they want to be more compassionate, self-compassionate, I'm a kind person to other people and also to myself. Right. So somebody who wants to change their negative self-talk to be more constructive self-talk might change their identity to make sure that that's carrying and leading their habit change at the daily level. That sort of like life coherence and self-coherence. And also actually James Cleary writes about this in Atomic Habits. Great book. Loved it. And he actually talks about some of this identity aspect, and how important that is in creating effective daily habits. If someone is say a smoker and is in an environment where many people are engaged in the same activity, it is very difficult to change the habit when you're used to doing something with your hands, or the deep breathing is actually very helpful and relaxing. But what is necessary to remove that, oh, I'm a healthy person and I treat my body well, is what I'm doing aligning with my identity, or my newfound identity, or my wish identity. So there's some, that's just one example. But it's a fascinating conversation, and I think the identity aspect really helps connect the dots of change.
There have certainly been changes in how you approach teaching as a result, perhaps, of what you've learned in this program. Have you noticed any changes in terms of your experience on stage or performing?
I used to get really nervous in my mid 20s, and convinced that the whole 2,000 people in the hall could see that I was, having a shaky bow and trying to make bow distribution to, all of these things. And I was immensely self-conscious about that. And I just kept pushing and just pushing myself through that. I even went to my doctor and asked, can I take beta blockers and things to help me through this? And actually, my blood pressure was such that he could not give me that because my heart would stop. Anyway, for some reason, there's a medical reason they could not give me beta blockers. And so I was like, well, I'm just going to have to figure this out on my own. And indeed, over time, that has resolved itself without, I significant effort and personal search, and increased confidence, mostly as I know who I am and I feel confident with my identity and secure and feeling secure in who I am. Um, and I've also changed my perspective. There's a bit of a reframe in my experience of the concert hall, is actually treating it as a sacred space. My relationship to the space that previously gave me nerves, I reframed the space and the experience and what we were doing. And in fact, I think the ability to create my why and have greater clarity with why I'm doing what I'm doing, that helped immensely in overcoming my psychological nerves back then.
It sounds like, identity wise, if I'm remembering what you said earlier, a lot of the core parts of your identity are oriented around, essentially, it sounds like seeking growth and change over time, as opposed to proving that you've arrived at any particular point to everybody else. And I wonder if that relates to this idea of the hall as a sacred place. Could you elaborate a little bit on that notion?
Yes, the notion of forever student and that constant self-growth is both an artistic one, that I remember Claude Frank in a coaching on Schubert Arpeggione, he said, the music is always better than it can be played. And that is the source of my artistic thriving. No matter how good one may think they are, the music is always going to be better. It's like a very platonic, like this is the way it's supposed to be. And we humble people are just going to keep trying to make the music and keep growing in that sense. As a human and as a sort of a kid at heart, that concept of growth also comes from my time in Waldorf school, which is constant learning. The childhood is spent with a deep sense of wonder, and the childhood is long. We're not given homework. Everything is intrinsically motivated. And there's plenty of structure in terms of the class time and schedule of the classes and everything. Um, and what's so wonderful about that is it has given me this sense of constant growth. And so I credit my parents' choices in both Suzuki and Waldorf education to encourage this sense of forever student. What it also does as a performer, transferring all of that back to the stage, is if I do make a mistake, I know I'm going to learn from it because I'm a forever student and I'm going to learn and grow from this. So even if something is, even though I'm trying my best, even if something is not appearing or sounding my best, I will grow from it and I will improve because I believe in myself, because I'm a forever student and right, and a striving artist to constantly grow. So those are kind of the how I grow in that sense. And lest there be any interpretation that there's self-coddling or too much, that I'm not actually, all of this is balanced out with the discipline of daily practice and the daily routine of healthy habits and healthy relationship with my cello. So I have my daily diet of my scales and Bach and my good shifting for my left hand, that I'm personally working on right now. So, that's that self-compassion and that mental approach is balanced out by the daily practice of actually improving from that, not just telling myself that I'm going to learn from it. I actually try to learn from it in my practice.
I feel like I need to take a moment and ask about shaky bow because I think all string players can relate to this and have their own journey and battle with shaky bow. How did you come to become more confident in that, or overcome or get through that moment where you had more kind of preoccupations with that concern?
I called Mr. Silverstein and I said, Mr. Silverstein, what do I do? I'm getting shaky bow. And he says, oh, I bet that happens as you approach the frog on an up bow, right? And I'm like, yes. And I felt so validated because, there's the concertmaster of the Boston Symphony saying, I know exactly what you're saying. So just that validation and being seen was like 90% of it. Just knowing I'm not alone. So that's the first thing. Just tell somebody you're not, we all know this. We all get nervous at some point. And how it manifests is also different at different times too, right? For some, it's a faster vibrato. For some, and it pops out sometimes. What he said was, and I actually forget now because that was like 20 or 18 years ago. But he did give me some tips about moving through, just keep the bow moving, and also about the relationship of my second finger and my thumb in that, on my bow hand, of course. But what that taught me was, for me, it didn't end up actually being my second finger and my thumb. It was both of my fingers. It was the spine of the hand for me. But that all it did was teach me I can focus on something specific instead of that it can be a very overwhelming feeling to be filled with anxiety under performance pressure, right? And it can feel like I used to feel swimming because I didn't know what to focus on. But just being told that Mr. Silverstein's technique was this, it helped me focus on what I realized, okay, this would be more helpful is experimenting with my bow grip as well as moving my arm through and making sure I'm not stopping my energy at any one of my particular joints. So that gave me a focus on a specific part that then ended up helping me move through this. And it was years. I didn't have any medication to help. I just kept experimenting and just kept going. So that was the first thing was well, three things. The validation from a great performer and pedagogue and mentor like Mr. Silverstein. The second thing was the practical focus elements. And the third was what I've already spoken about, which was my evolved identity as creating experiences for our listeners, for our being a musical messenger, and that I don't actually matter. It's the Schuberts, it's the Florence Prices that matter. It's the music that matters. And I better get over myself. That kind of thing. So there's a couple of layers to that in my personal
Right.
journey.
I think we already started to get a little bit to this idea that enacting change on an individual level can be challenging enough as it's doing so on an organizational level,
Mm,
not so easy either.
mm-mm.
I'm curious if what you've learned in the program has given you some tools with which to help facilitate organizational change. But maybe the real question is, if say you had the ability to like snap your fingers and change anything in the musical world, whether it's related to how orchestras work, auditions, competitions, conservatories, summer festivals, and so forth, and just to like test it out for a year and experiment for a year. So, not naming names, of course, like, are there any things in any of those domains that you would love to see what would happen if X or Y or Z were to change for a year?
This is the kind of thing that Joe and I talk about on our podcast, Tacet No More, which is how do we how does one change an industry that is so embedded in tradition and European aristocracy from our the get-go, right? And in the already the hierarchical difference of musicians being paid to go play. This is just in the orchestra setting. Oh my gosh, that is a rich, multifaceted question. So we only have an hour. um, this is going to be very controversial. I think we need to be looking at our audition, our onboarding, how we onboard, and also how we the beginnings and endings of careers, questioning everything about our education system, our pipeline, that diversity is excellence. We know even from evolution that, when we have more than one type of in a botany setting, that's when new species arrive. That's when new things happen. That's where our world evolves when the ecosystems meet. But we need more diversity in every way because that will change our canon, which will then be more representative of who we are and tell our story more accurately. We need to think about, and I'm thinking about my retirement and my end as an orchestral performer. Do we change? Do we evolve into going into management so that people who've been there, done that as an orchestra servant are now serving the orchestra, having been there, done that for 20 or 40, 50 years, who now go into roles that manage what they have been through so that the next generation of musicians can trust the managers as real lived experience givers, having been there. We have much to learn from each other. And that was one thing that was so fascinating about going to grad school was learning from each other. I forgot what the question was. So I don't know if I've
I've
answered
I've
it.
I've forgotten as well, to be
Okay.
honest.
I paused so I cut that out. If I, I mean, cut my question, like I forgot the question. Anyway.